So welcome to Dreaming Jaguars. Today we are privileged enough to interview Pascal. Pascal is Dr. David Luke's PhD student at the Greenwich University. Pascal is studying near-death experience, and recently Justin and I were privileged enough to take part in an experiment which is shared visions. Is primarily what the experiment was trying to determine whether or not there's any telepathy present during the DMT experience. It was very, very interesting. We are going to be able to talk about that at some time in the future once we get the go-ahead from Pascal and Dr. David Luke. So yeah, that's what we're doing today, and it's going to be a good one. So enjoy.
From our perspective, we can't discuss the telepathy experiment, so I know you're doing a thesis on near-death experience and DMT, and I know a lot of our viewers are quite interested in hearing about that. So can you give us some sort of information on what your thesis is about?
Sure, yeah, definitely. So my thesis is primarily about near-death experience, but actually a lot of the research is about DMT experience, because DMT is very, very understudied, and I originally got into it, wanted to do it especially because not least because of Strassman's, Rich Strassman's 1990s DMT studies, and when he brought out the spirit molecule, it was subtitled Doctor's Revolutionary Research into the Biology of Mystical and Near-Death Experiences. He basically postulated that endogenous DMT in our bodies, which there is released at the time of death from the pineal gland, like the third eye. So it was just so fascinating that this could be a possibility. I essentially just wanted to look into the kind of neurochemistry of the near-death experience. But I also wasn't completely convinced of that. So I just, there was a dearth of research about it, so I wanted to enter into it. And basically, what I found is that I think, so far at least, is that it's too simplistic an idea. Just DMT is responsible for the near-death experience, and it's just squared out the pineal gland, when you die. Okay. But there's such a rich overlap as well, and that whole sort of thesis is trying to get out all the nuances of what the similarities and differences are. I think now basically there's a gross overall structure, I'd say, that a framework. I think of them in terms of templates of the features of the experience, which are really similar, and that's why DMT is so interesting. That's why it is the unique chemical really to look at in terms of near-death experience, because what happens is in both experiences you kind of disembody, you lose awareness of your body, you feel this sort of movement or propulsion through space, elsewhere, and then you end up in a different environment, an ostensive other world, and there are these other agents, these beings, entities that you're somehow interacting, communing with, and that's what's similar, that's what's basically identical, but then everything else from that point onwards, in my opinion so far, is different. I like to think of it in terms of the other world and the beings that you might encounter when you die, in these classic near-death experiences, as a sort of Western Christian, let's say, it's very common for them maybe to end up in these rolling hills, beautiful valleys, and they might meet a luminous being, which they see, experiences like Christ, And then with DMT, what might happen is you might end up in some kind of hyperspatial, hyperfractal realm where the entities that you're commune with might end up being more sort of mechanical clown, sort of beings, So yeah, that's where I'm at in a lot of ways so far.
Okay. Right. So from what we've just discussed, the study that Rick Strausman done and his theory that the DMT came from the pineal gland. There's been recent research with studies of rats. Can you elaborate to the viewers so that we can get some sort of real understanding of what that actually means?
For sure, yeah. I mean, yeah, so Strassman, it was all just hypothesis, you know. I mean, to me, it's very interesting that he really he created this meme almost about the DMT and near-death experience and its similarity. But if you read his chapters about it, Death and Dying, you know, I mean, there's a couple of people whose experiences look a bit like near-death experience. I've read every single of one of his original, experiences reports. You know, like over 400 of them, and you know, I attest to that. Like, it's a couple of people which have like interestingly similar themes, but that's a tiny minority. So what you really want to see if DMT is really implicated in death and dying is, I mean, far cry from actually, you know, knocking off some human beings and measuring their, you know, brain levels of DMT like you do it in animal research. So there's this study in Michigan, a few studies actually now, in this research lab by Gimo Borgigan in Michigan, and so yeah, the most recent one, like this summer, by John Dean, they asphyxiated these rats, and they found a number of interesting things, you know. So maybe there's like four main tenets of fascinating things they found. Was that the two enzymes necessary for the synthesis of DMT are, and that's INMT and AADC, right? And they're found all throughout the rat cortex, right? So from that, you know, it could imply that even in the human brain, because they are mammals, there are the enzymatic machinery to actually synthesize DMT in the brain. You know, before we thought it was in the peripheries, you know, and that's, you know, because it was only measured in the blood and the spinal fluid, you know, and the tiny quantities. So they thought, oh, you know, it's DMT is probably produced there, but in like really kind of infinitesimal, you know, non-psychoactive quantities, you know. But now it looks like it's actually may well be synthesized in the brain, and from that you don't even need all of this hullabaloo. And there's been a lot of back and forth between David Nichols, Edie Frexer, you know, other academics, like how the hell is produced in enough quantities in the body and then funneled to the brain if it really were responsible for like near-death experience, you know, the point of death, because it needs to go through the blood-brain barrier, it needs to be all these like mechanisms to get into the brain. But if it's in the brain, then it's in the brain. And then they found that DMT was actually, the levels of the DMT was similar, like comparable levels to other normal transmitters.
Like a serotonin.
Exactly, like serotonin,
okay.
Exactly, which is one of our most fundamental neurotransmitters. So it was found to be similar levels, and so it used to be called like a trace amine, DMT, because it's an amine molecule, and like trace as in it's just in these tiny quantities. But now it can't really be classified as that anymore because it's similar levels to serotonin. I mean, naturally it's in the rat, we always need to remember that, but it's, you know, that's, the rat model is like a key neuroscientific model for the human being, right?
So my question then would be, like, does it work as to help us create this reality, like the reality we create in a DMT scape? Could you then propose that DMT is used in the brain like serotonin normally throughout the day to be able to perceive what we perceive?
Potentially, you know, but that is quite a big speculation at the moment, because I think there's like DMT Quest, like there's a couple of articles, you know, about this study, and you know, this is sort of coming more into the limelight, and you know, he kind of suggests that as well. So all of our experience is chemically mediated. You know, I'm not a subscriber per se to the idea that it's generated by that, but you can't deny that it's mediated by it. You know, so whether it's DMT or serotonin, dopamine or adrenaline, it all saturates our brain, and that's how it mediates our experience of the world. You know, and so putting, you know, DMT into the mix, which we know is a crazy potent hallucinogen, you can easily like think that, like, you know, that now gives that implication that this could be kind of almost like a hallucinated reality. But I mean, serotonin in very like high quantities itself is, you know, has psychedelic properties, because of course that is what psychedelics mimic in order to have their psychedelic effect. But what I would say, I think, is like the guy actually in Sussex down the road, Anil Seth, you know, he proposes, you know, this idea that the brain generates a reality in terms of it being hallucinatory, and almost like you hallucinate your reality. But he more comes at it from the perspective of like predictive coding, you know, which is a very highly complex computational neuroscience thing which I don't really understand. But it's you know, the idea that through development, when we're a little fetus and when we develop, our brain is like intrinsically plastic, right? So it learns about reality throughout its experience. That's what the brain has evolved to be, this beautiful plastic machine to instantiate all sensory experience in it, and then through development it hones that enough to the point of generating internally your reality, and then every other piece of sensory input that you get is like a tiny fraction that all it does is tweaks the internal model. So where DMT or other endogenous hallucinogens can come into that picture, you know, who knows? I don't know actually.
Wow.
Nice. That's cool as fuck. Okay, so just touching back on the rat studies then. So asphyxiated rats have increased levels of DMT in the brain at the point of death.
Yeah.
So what in your opinion is the, you know, what could be the end result of that study? Where could that take us? What else could be uncovered within that framework?
Yeah, I mean, that paper just blew my mind, you know, it was amazing. So, yeah, I mean, that's almost like what, you know, all this kind of community wants to see. It's like, okay, so DMT, it really is actually produced in the brain at the point of death, you know, in this mammal, you know. So, I mean, technically, it was increased sixfold. Like, the maximal increase from baseline levels in the brain was times 6, right?
Were those levels so if you were able to scale that up, would in a human, would that be levels of a psychedelic property?
That's the $1 million question, really, isn't it? Because yeah, I mean, it's still in the rat it's 600% baseline, you know.
Yeah,
so if that's scaled up, you know, in some comparable way, then that's still really significant, but depends on what the levels were in the first place. And so
it's amazing, to say the least, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is definitely, and it's really, really indicative. But I mean, the technical, like, sort of concentration sort of match of it is, I believe that the maximal concentration was about 5 like nanomolar, and if you look at like Strassman's studies with Gallimore as well, for instance, you know, it's approximately 65 nanomolar, the concentration, like in the kind of synaptic, you know, fluids that you require to have this breakthrough type, you know, psychedelic DMT experience. So it's still kind of a far cry, but the thing with that is that's just what the data that we have so far is. You know, it's all to do with, you know, the specifics of what particular lobes in the brain, you know, what particular time course after asphyxiation, you know, the DMT was measured. So, you know, I've been, you know, liaising with, you know, John Dean, the author of the paper, trying to get to the bottom of the nuances of this, and, you know, and those are important factors you need to consider. You know, when those are different, it could be that DMT is actually much higher levels, you know.
Or I mean, maybe so as in a human being having a breakthrough psychedelic DMT experience, you know, in the norm, the brain could be you know, functioning in a certain way, but is there a possibility that at the point of death the brain functions in a completely different way, and that smaller amount of DMT could have a much more far-reaching
definitely
effects?
Man, that's like, I love that question, because that's actually a part of my PhD that I'm trying to address. So I love that you're like fucking on it. Yeah, because Yeah, that's exactly, because it could be these smaller amounts which might not be like canonically psychoactive, you know, that release at death, but yeah, the brain actually at death, so much else could be happening. This profusion of different types of neurochemical, electrochemical activity, which could mean that little injection of DMT
makes it go so much
exactly
further.
Basically catalyzes, catapults it, you know, because the other part of the major like studies in the neurobiology of death that this Michigan lab is putting out is not just the chemical activity but the electrical activity, the neuroelectric activity. So using EEGs on these little rats as they're being asphyxiated, you know, and they found that very high frequency, very highly coherent and synchronous electrical activity is being produced as well, you know, and that's in the gamma range, you know, and that these are indices of electric activity pertaining to very high level conscious awareness, even in the human being. You know, so if that's happening simultaneously with DMT, then who knows how, you know, what that permutation can mean. You know?
Yeah, because I'm guessing it's like, so the brain is just trying to wrap my layman's head around it. So the brain during a normal breakthrough DMT experience, as the DMT enters the brain is sort of in a place that is within normal waking consciousness. Whereas obviously at the point of death, what you're saying is there's all sorts of electro activity going on. The brain can be fired up in a completely different way, and thus that smaller amount of DMT takes you to the place.
I believe so. What I would also compound that with is, again, it's not, I mean, we're building slowly like the whole bigger picture, you know, DMT, all this like high level gamma activity, but then there's this cornucopia of other neurochemical activity as well, and that's what Dave Nichols, if you look at all the back and forth, you know, is really saying, you know, the latest point now is that people are still getting hung up on DMT and stuff when there's all this other activity,
which in itself is having this psychedelic effect.
Absolutely, and not only can it itself have all the psychedelic effects, like not least serotonin, like in these rats asphyxia, you know, being increased up to 250 times the original amount. You know, that's 25,000% the original amount. You know. And that, you know, noradrenaline, you know, dopamine, which all have their very distinct effects on consciousness as well. You know, so it's not only that, but it's how that interacts with the DMT. And like, for instance, what Nichols says is because there's so much more serotonin, and not least that, but it has a kind of bonding affinity, you know, like with the serotonin 2A receptor, which is how psychedelics have their effect. It's how tightly and how comfortably or easily it binds to that receptor is like 10 times that of DMT. You know, so it's like he thinks it will kind of blow the DMT effect out of the water. But then again, if you look at the detailed stuff, you know, when talking to John Dean and stuff, you know, it's all about the timing of it. You know, the areas in the brain that occurs, because if that's
I fucking knew that was
you're right, mate.
I just knew I was going to wind up.
I was looking at you and I was hoping, because I could see that you were looking. I was like,
I'm waiting for a break that I can go, stop!
We'll keep that in. We were just about to wrap that question up before Justin went arse over tip down the bank. So Pascal, sorry dude, carry on. So we'll get to the crux of that question.
So basically that last bit, just that it could be, although it looks like there's too much serotonin and it will displace the small amount of DMT which doesn't have as strong an affinity for that same receptor. You know, although that looks like you're kind of, you know, sort of losing a point for, like, you know, DMT having a significant role in it, it's still just the data that we have so far. Like if you tweak, you know, where we look in terms of, you know, if you look at different parts of the brain, you know, death, because it wasn't all parts of the brain that were actually measuring DMT. It was like the occipital, I'm pretty sure the occipital lobe, sort of visual lobe at the back. and also the timing of it, right? So they only did it, because it's a sort of initial pilot sort of study of this, really. So they sort of measured it at 15 to 30 minute intervals, but in the previous study where they found all of the serotonin and all of that was at like minutes, every minute, so if they did that with DMT and looking everywhere in the brain, it could well be that there's higher levels all over the brain, and that could then have, more of a, it could then mean that DMT actually does have more of a functional role, in death, despite everything else happening kind of all around it.
That's awesome, man.
We're off, yeah. Okay, so we've had some great conversation. I suppose from our perspective now, we'd just like to hear where you would like to see this go, what you're hoping is going to be, what would come out of this information that you're studying, and for the future, what would it mean for us?
Right. Big last question.
Big question.
Ultimately, what is the nature of these experiences? What can we really take from this in a much wider, materialist or metaphysical, perspective on it? I think I'm very averse to both, thinking, okay, these far out, DMT experiences, near-death experiences are internally generated hallucinations. I'm not convinced of that. That kind of reductionist, materialist kind of. But I'm equally not completely convinced yet of them being kind of the complete opposite. Them clearly being evidence of there being a different reality that we have access to, that we might, have come from, or we might go, when we die. So I'm hopefully trying to be as level-headed and agnostic, kind of budding academic as I can be. But I certainly have my inklings so far, thus far in what I've seen and researched. And I think it's somewhere, like the truth is complex, I think is like what Noam Chomsky likes to say, and it's somewhere very much in between. So I'm of the impression so far that it's, almost like an idealistic, panpsychic perspective of consciousness being far more important than we're really giving it credit for. Clearly, more than the materialists are giving it credit for. And if it does have more of a fundamental function in reality, then these kinds of immensely profound psychedelic experiences, mind-expanding experiences, are showing us a kind of deeper substratum of reality, which might have consciousness at its core. So we're having these imaginal experiences, and then that word's an important word to distinguish it from just imaginative. So it's not that we're just creating this from our minds, but the imaginal implies that the mind is more fundamental. So when you're kind of any phenomenological experience is real in and of itself, in a way. So I think the near-death DMT experiences tap into a deeply archetypal, collective, unconscious space, and that's what we're interacting with. And I think that's why it accounts for the repeatability, the reproducibility of all of the themes, in the DMT chip. That's why everyone's so interested in it. It's like, if it's just a BS hallucination, why is all the same themes coming up? Why is everyone experiencing all the same stuff? So it can account for that, because if it's tapping into things that human beings, maybe non-human sort of species have been experiencing since time immemorial. And it also accounts for the familiarity of it because it is like the sort of bedrock of experience, since time immemorial. So of course it's going to have this, nothing else is going to feel more familiar than that because it's at our core. And obviously the hyper reality of it. It's like you can just have one of these experiences, and there's some recent research from John Hopkins, saying that there's like nothing else that can just extinguish an atheist's atheism, more than like DMT, because of not least because of like the hyper reality of it. It's like it's too real. Like I can like say all of these skeptical things about it, but it's just too real. And I think that can account for that as well. You know, when you really immerse yourself in the collective unconscious, because like Jordan Peterson, for instance, he's like a really quite profound like psychoanalyst, clinical psychoanalyst, I think, and he says that the archetypes are the most real things, that just by definition, because they are the basic most units of reality and experience. So I think that all of this layers up to be quite a convincing kind of sort of hypothesis sort of so far. I mean, we don't know what the collective unconscious is, but it's a good framework to begin with, I think.
Are we rolling? Okay, so we'd like to say a big thank you to Pascal for coming out and giving us some amazing information. I thought that will be brilliant for our viewers. There was lots of gems there. I might start that again, actually. It sounded good. Right, I'd like to thank Pascal for coming in. We've had an amazing bit of information there.
Thank you guys. Yeah, it's been amazing. It's sick. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's really, really great. We've got some good stuff coming up. So like and subscribe, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you guys later.